very first question I've got is, right, who are you trying to reach with the book? What's the audience you're trying to get to?
Well, I'm specifically trying to reach web content writers. So whether someone's writing a post or writing an article or any other page on their website, these are the people I want to reach. It's not the copywriters, because the copywriters have always obsessed over headlines. They know that very often the headline is, you either make it or break it on that page with the headline. Content writers, I don't think, do pay as much attention to the headline, and I think that's a real shame, because I think they lose a lot of readers who would otherwise read the whole page.
Right, and why do you think that is? Why do people not pay attention to the headline?
Well, it's kind of weird. In the days of print, and I talk about that in the book, if you work for the New York Times as a journalist, you don't actually write the headline yourself. It's written by the copy editor. And the copy editor is very highly skilled in writing headlines. I mean, if you want to find some good headlines, go and look at the front cover of National Enquirer or Cosmopolitan magazine or People magazine, and you will see lots of very short headlines and subheads, and a huge amount of work goes into writing those. In fact, I was listening to someone the other day who was telling me that on the front cover of Cosmopolitan magazine, a senior person spends close to a week writing and refining those short headings on the front of the magazine there, because they're absolutely critical.
Wow.
Now, if we go over to the web, we don't really have that writer, copy editor thing happening. Very often, as authors of pages or blog posts, we write the headlines ourselves, and we tend to make them kind of descriptive. Hey, I'm going to write about such and such. And we don't really pay attention to the craft of headline writing. Certainly, we don't give it the attention it is given in the newspaper and magazine industry. And also, there are some very specific demands when writing headlines for the web. I put the book out because it struck me that there are online copywriters, there are online content writers. And like I say, with copywriters already obsess over the headline, but content writing, not so much. So I just see a lot of headlines that either fail to hook me, or very often they tell the whole story, so I really don't need to read any further, or they just don't do a good job, and it's a huge wasted opportunity.
Well, that's really interesting, because I would have been very familiar with the first point you said, that people don't get the headline right at the start. But I'm intrigued to hear you say that sometimes you can tell too much in a headline.
Yeah, I mean,
why is that?
If a headline says, and I'm thinking again of a newspaper or something, Obama signs bill about XYZ, that's it. I know what the story is now. If I'm terribly interested in that bill, then I'll read it. But if not, I've got the information I need. Oh, he's signed the bill. A headline has to leave you hanging. There has to be a little bit of mystery in there, or it has to pique your curiosity. I'll give you a great example. This is from a local paper from a place I haven't lived there. This was west coast of Canada. It must be about 15 years ago now. And the headline was in two parts. It said, "Body found, man still missing." Now, that's a beautiful headline, because you read it and you say, and you have to read the article, right? Like, what is this? How can the body be found but the man still missing? So you read the article to find out. There's also, when it comes to the web, there's a huge thing that has happened recently called social media. And what this means is that, as writers, as web content writers, we happily write our web content for our post or our web page, and very often the performance of the headline kind of depends maybe on a subhead underneath, or it kind of depends on reading the first few lines. Well, that was great a few years ago, but what happens now is if I find that you've written an article on Wordtracker, and I think, hey, that's really cool, and I decide to tweet about it with a link, all of a sudden your headline is ripped away from the body of the content, and it's standing alone in a tweet. or it may stand alone in an RSS feed, or stand alone or almost alone on Reddit, or almost alone on Facebook. So all of a sudden, we can no longer depend on the body of the content to support the headline.
Mhm.
And it's true also, you may have some people write headlines that kind of depend on seeing an image at the same time as reading the headline. When you're being tweeted or retweeted, you don't see that image. So all of a sudden now, headlines, web content headlines, really have to work alone. And probably we can blame Twitter for this, with this 140 character limit. We really have to write short headlines that are very good. We've got 140 characters, but we don't want to lose them all because we want people to retweet it and maybe re-retweet it. So we've got to stay well under the 140 character, probably under 100 characters for our headline. So all of a sudden, this is turning into a real skill. You ask anyone in the newspaper or magazine industry, or anyone who's a professional copywriter, how important is the headline? And they'll say, well, that's like 90% of the job.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get past it, then the page has failed.
Yeah, and I look at my own habits in the morning when I open up Twitter, and I just scan very, very quickly through multiple columns. And if something doesn't,
and if it's right, I mean, I wrote a post. I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and the post was about headline design. Like how do you actually design a headline to stand out in a Twitter feed? I mean, there are some obvious things, like at the end of you might have square bracket video in caps, close square bracket. That's headline design. It catches the eye. Or you might have some numbers, or you might capitalize something. So yeah, there are all kinds of little tricks to actually make a headline jump out from the crowd. And it really is a crowd if you're looking at a Twitter stream or an RSS stream feed, or on all kinds of places you're going to see that headline without the benefit of the surrounding content. So one, it has to catch the eye. Secondly, it has to be short so that it's shareable. And thirdly, it has to make people think, wow, I want to click through and read this. This is intriguing. There's a mystery here. The headline has tweaked my interest, but I feel myself compelled to find out more about this. And it's that degree of attention and craft that I think most content writers just don't get into right now. Content headlines are written far too quickly. Without really any focus on everything we've just been talking about. That this is an absolute skill, and it can make a huge difference to the success of your web content.
Well, that's fantastic. So, really, what you're saying is that headline really has to do an awful lot of hard work, and even more work than it did in the newspaper industry in the past.
To a degree, yeah. I mean, certainly, yes. Like I say, newspapers typically spend a great deal of attention on headlines, but at least you're holding the newspaper. In our case, in a Twitter feed, you're not even holding my daily edition or my tweet. You're choosing between newspapers at that point. So yeah, essential in the newspaper business, but we face an even tougher job, and people just don't get this yet.
Well, Nick, I always love reading your writing, so I have a question for you about the articles that you write. Which comes first? Is it the article that comes first, or is it the headline in your head that you think about first?
Well, actually, what I think about is the topic. I write a headline almost as a placeholder. My first headline, the one that I write in at the top of the page, is usually descriptive, but not a very good headline. Then I start writing the body of the post or the article. And then somewhere along there, I think, I've always got in my mind that I've got to make that headline good. I've got to do, it's got to be short enough. It's got to have some intrigue. It's got to hook the reader. So then I go back and I revise the headline, and I might revise the headline 3 or 4 times. I don't try and get it perfect before I start writing. Like I say, I put a placeholder in, which is usually just a fairly generic descriptive headline, which is where most people stop, by the way. as they put in the kind of generic descriptive headline, and then they leave that as their final draft. I have that as my first draft, and then as I'm writing and after I've written, I go back and I think, okay, how can, given the way the post has unfolded, how can I make that headline a little more interesting, a little more intriguing, a little more shareable?